Well, my friends, it's been a while, and I'm way behind by 4 or 5 videos, courtesy of COVID. Now, where I got the fever, the chills, and worst of all, the sore throat for 2 weeks. And even if I was willing to do a haphazard job just to get a video out, I couldn't even phone it in, because...
What good is a phone call if you're unable to speak?
I do apologize if I sound a little bit strange today. Now I figured this is probably the first thing most of you would want to see. So without further ado, here is the PNSO's Aubrey, the Torosaurus. Now this model measures 23 centimeters or 9.1 inches long, and taking an average of 8 meters or 26 feet gives us a nice 1:35 scale. Now, since both Triceratops and Torosaurus have been estimated to be up to 9 meters long, or 29.5 feet, this does scale very nicely with Doyle, although I wish it was a little bigger than the Triceratops. Still, it's a nice generous size, and you really can't complain about that, with quite a good heft to it too. The name Torosaurus means not bull lizard as you might assume with the Spanish toro, though it certainly seems worthy of the name, but rather perforated lizard, and referring to its characteristic parietal fenestrae. Of course, the most obvious and striking feature of Torosaurus is the head, and indeed more specifically, the frill. I'm really happy because I really want the frill that's most definitely and unambiguously Torosaurus, and you get that here, especially from the side. You see the rather flat form without the upturning that defines Triceratops, and it has a really impressive length that overhangs the shoulders. Now, Torosaurus is one of those ceratopsians often cited as an example of why the frill couldn't be used for defense, given the large parietal fenestrae. This plays therefore a more plausible function, and you can see this function supported by a pattern that's worthy of such a huge billboard. Unlike the Triceratops, the pattern is striking, and these traditional eye spots, which seem to go in and out of style at various times. And here they remind me of all the depictions I've seen. The colors themselves are close to the release image, although the pattern boundaries lose that subtle transition, and so can look a little artificial, which is a bit of a pity. Nevertheless, they are very nice, and especially with that detail on the frill, gives this an aliveness seldom seen in many ceratopsian models. On the other side, the color is just one blotch of orange, with the faintest of transitions, and an abrupt end here where the neck begins, which is most unfortunate. When I first saw the release images, I was a little disturbed and it took me a little while to figure out why. And then I realized it's the very long face, and since the jaw articulates, you have these seam lines here. A Torosaurus does have a rather long skull, and since PNSO favors the cheekless look, with just the AMES muscle partially filling in some of the gap, this is a very long gap that isn't filled. I do believe that true muscular cheeks aside, it's always possible to still have some kind of pseudo-cheek or other connecting soft tissue. I've talked at length about the cheekless appearance and the role of the AMES muscle in both the PNSO Triceratops and Iguanodon videos, so you can look at those if you're interested. But here I really have to say that in person, it doesn't look bad at all, and it grows on you after a while. On the inside, you can see a nicely separated tongue. And on the roof, you see the teeth within, which is a very nice touch I'm always happy to see in ornithischians, though particular collectors will want to touch it up a bit. Other than that, facially, the detail is as per PNSO's usual quality. Nicely defined scalation with regional variability in size, shape, and indeed relief. The color fade is rather pleasing as well, especially here in the rostral region. the orbital horns are nice and long, and have the same kind of texture as the Triceratops, which is a nice standardization of quality, though overall compared to the release image, there's of course a shade less subtlety. Now, Torosaurus has 10 or more epiparietals, with no midline epiparietal, which is nicely accurate, at least for Torosaurus latus. Torosaurus utahensis is similar to Triceratops in having a midline epiparietal. The nasal horn, on the other hand, is of the shallow type, lacking the longer horn of Triceratops process and more similar to the shallow one of Triceratops horridus. I should add here that like all ceratopsians, there's probably quite a bit of variability in morphology of features. For example, all of these skulls are Torosaurus. In fact, the nasal horn can be short, pointed and erect, such as you see in YPM 1830, and low and indistinct in MOR 981, MOR 1122, and ANSP 15192. The postorbital horns can be large and rostrally curved, as in MOR 981, and relatively small and straight, as in MOR 1122 and ANSP 15192. And the Torosaurus frill in my childhood image was this. Indeed, I was hoping to see more of this in the PNSO. However, while this is indeed seen in YPM 1831 and MOR 1122, the frill can be quite erect, as in ANSP 15192 and YPM 1830. So put together, this PNSO does really well as an amalgam of various morphologies, and yet is clearly Torosaurus for me. As for the rest of the animal, you can see for yourself all the detail. Now here, down here, in this area, you'll definitely appreciate the detail more when I do my comparisons later. Now overall, the bioplan is typically ceratopsian, and yet there's a nice bulk that hints at even more power and muscle than we've seen in some of the other offerings so far. You see that in a short, compact torso, the solid limbs, the powerful tail, and even this pose, which looks to me like the animal has just braked suddenly, or is about to make a quick change of direction. The massive nature of the limbs and the toes, especially in the feet, are really pleasing. Now, I really like the Charles R. Knight pose of this Triceratops, but in this Torosaurus, I get a different kind of vibe, something more active, and so I'm really pleased to see two kinds of poses. And as for the baby Dabei, this is a wonderful and welcome addition indeed. The form is typically juvenile ceratopsian, with some nice detail. It looks very similar to the sideshow Triceratops baby, but I wouldn't be surprised if they all look pretty much the same as babies. The only obvious lack here is on the underside, especially if you were to compare it with the Stegosaurus baby. The color is not very complex, though with definite effort made to create shades. It's really nice to see a little baby ceratopsians, since we did already get a baby Stegosaurus. I also like this inclusion because of a couple other reasons. First, it clearly adds to the overall message here that not only is Torosaurus a separate genus, but we even include specifically a baby Torosaurus to drive home that message. And second, if you watch Walking with Dinosaurs, you doubtless have remembered
the little Torosaurus lost his fight with the predators.
And now we can at least get to protect this little guy. Now just a bit of science before we get to the comparisons. Now Torosaurus is such a favorite of mine, I've actually got way too much to say, so let's keep it short and focus on this Triceratops Torosaurus can of worms. I can only touch on some highlights, and I'll leave article references below if you'd like to follow the ins and outs of this fascinating controversy. Now Horner, after dealing with Stygimoloch and proposing synonymization with Pachycephalosaurus, turned his attention to Torosaurus. In his 2010 paper with Scannella, the claim this time was that Torosaurus was a mature form of Triceratops, developing the fenestrations only later in life. They also suggest that USNM 2412, Nedoceratops, was an example of a transitional form. Now effectively for Triceratops lovers, they could breathe a sigh of relief, since Triceratops was named first, and only a relative few would mourn Torosaurus. No one seemed to give a shit about Nedoceratops. Now there have been a few challenges to this idea, so let's have a quick overview of the more interesting ones. Longridge and Field 2012 investigated the problem by applying the principle of falsifiability. Now, this says that a theory can only be considered scientific if it can be tested and proven false. For example, all Borrelopelters are red can be falsified if we found proof of a Borrelopelter that was blue, for example. Now, Longridge and Field argued that synonymizing Torosaurus and Triceratops as growth stages of the same genus, let's call this the Toromorph hypothesis, implies three testable or falsifiable predictions. 1. They must have the same distributions in the fossil record. 2. They must differ in their relative maturity. And 3. They must be linked by morphological intermediates. That's to say, there must be a transitional form between the younger Triceratops and the older Torosaurus. Now all three must be unambiguously satisfied if the synonymy hypothesis is to be supported. So the first prediction, that fossils should be found in the same locations. In fact, their geographical ranges don't perfectly coincide. In the very north of the Scollard Formation, Alberta for example, you find only Triceratops, while in the south, such as in the Javelina Formation, Texas, only Torosaurus is known. However, because of the relative scarcity of Torosaurus, this could easily represent a sampling artifact, and therefore they concluded that the Toromorph hypothesis could be corroborated by the first prediction. The second prediction, all Torosaurus specimens would be mature, while all Triceratops specimens should be relatively immature. Now ideally we'd infer maturity from long bones, but most Torosaurus skulls lack an associated skeleton. And therefore to test this second prediction, Longridge and Field proposed a list of 24 characters that describe skull traits reflecting maturity, such as bone surface texture, fusion between bones, and cranial ornament development. The summary of the findings is, out of 6 Torosaurus specimens, 3 were found to be adults. 1 could not be determined. ANSP 15192 is a young adult. YPM 1831 is a subadult, especially obvious here in the unfused occipital condyle that forms the ball and socket neck joint, and the striated surface texture of the parietal. Now meanwhile, for the Triceratops specimens, they were found to range from young juveniles to very old adults. Therefore, they concluded that the test of the second prediction refuted the hypothesis, because there was no clear spectrum of maturity as we go from Triceratops to Torosaurus. Now the third prediction, transitional forms between Torosaurus and Triceratops, must exist. And since Torosaurus has parietal fenestrae and Triceratops none, intermediate forms showing the incipient development of these fenestrae must exist. Now, they considered the claim that thin areas on Triceratops frills were precursors of parietal fenestrae as proof of a transitional phase. However, as you can see here, these thin depressed areas are defined by a fossa that spans both the parietal and the squamosal, whereas in Torosaurus, the fenestrae are entirely enclosed within the parietals. And also, these so-called depressions are bordered by very thick bone, while the Torosaurus holes are surrounded by relatively thin bone. And therefore, Longridge and Field concluded that the Toromorph hypothesis failed in the third prediction. And since 2 out of the 3 predictions were refuted, the Toromorph hypothesis should be rejected. Now, a morphospace is a graphical representation of all the possible forms, shapes, and structures an organism could have. Now, this paper specifically analyzes the morphospace that describes Torosaurus, Triceratops horridus, Triceratops prorsus, and Nedoceratops skulls, correlated with maturity. A total of 27 skulls were examined, and the degree of overlap between the various specimens should be an indication to whether they constitute a single genus or multiple genera. So they took many landmarks and semi-landmarks, as you can see here, to quantify the overall cranial morphology as well as phenotypic differences. Again, another paper I can't do justice to, but in the crudest summary, what we find is that in various aspects, Torosaurus' later skulls, marked by the blue circles, were sufficiently different from Triceratops horridus and prorsus, the grey and black circles respectively, while these last 2 did show an overlap as might be expected. A Nedoceratops in the red circles as a transitional form between the 2 was invalidated based on this analysis, and this is the case looking at changes in skull shape associated with size, changes in skull but without the frill shape associated with size, changes in the frill shape associated with size, and changes in the squamosal shape associated with size. The reliability of this analysis was reduced because of the small number of Torosaurus specimens, but nonetheless the separation is clear. So finally, some comparisons. First, obviously, has to be the recent Doyle the Triceratops. Now, interestingly, as I explained in the PNSO Triceratops review, this model was based on AMNH 5116, which, because of the original damaged state, has sometimes been suspected to actually have been another Torosaurus. Still, this scalloping here helps to save it, but it's a little amusing to consider that you might very well have a pair of Torosauruses. On the other hand, in Torosaurus here, there's no such ambiguity, and that's really nice to see. The differences in the nasal and the postorbital horns serve to add some differentiation, and very pleasingly, you'll see that unlike Triceratops, which has a midline epiparietal here, the P0, Torosaurus doesn't have it, at least the later species, so that's a very happy thing to see. In addition, Torosaurus has a conspicuous parietal squamosal ridge here, which is absent in Triceratops. In terms of detail, you can see that Torosaurus seems to have actually improved the scale detail beyond the Triceratops, especially evident in the eyelid area. Looking down the rest of the body, I think you can see here how the scales appear to be smaller than in Doyle. This is really a very good sign that PNSO isn't one to rest on its laurels and is always striving to improve. In my opinion, if you could get just one, I would get the Torosaurus. The pose, the coloration, the unusual genus, the frill shape, the detail, all of this adds up to being the more desirable one to have on the shelf, along with the hundreds of Triceratops I'm sure you already have. And how about a comparison with some of the other recent ceratopsians? The Centrosaurus, the Styracosaurus, and of course my standard comparison to the 2020 Wilson T-Rex. And so now we have it, finally, a Torosaurus from PNSO, and a nice distribution of ceratopsians. I'd hoped for more chasmosaurines, and now with the addition of Torosaurus, I have it. If I were to be greedy and to push my luck, I'd still hope for a proper Chasmosaurus and Pentaceratops, but I think we're really off to a good start to filling out the chasmosaurines. Now I feel that with the museum line being as expensive, for Western collectors especially, an extra in the form of a baby, or even the skull with the Triceratops, goes a longer way towards soothing both the wallet and the conscience, and I hope that this is something that PNSO can do more of. Once again, PNSO has done a great job manifesting a genus I think many of us were hoping for, and they keep delivering us new dinosaurs of the kind of quality that we wouldn't have dreamt of 5 or 10 years ago. And they do this even through the difficulties imposed by the pandemic situation. So, my congratulations to PNSO for giving us once again a beautiful ceratopsian, and I'm really looking forward to even more. I'll see you guys soon in the next video.